Hi, we continue in Genesis 47 today in what I think is one of the most amazing passages in the book of Genesis and maybe in all of Scripture, as Joseph the foreigner stands over all the people of Egypt and gets them to give up everything, all their money, all their animals, all their land, and their very lives in exchange for food, and say thank you at the end. It's such an amazing passage, and yet some scholars seemingly find this as divinely sanctioned, that they believe Joseph at the end where he says, God has done this. But I'd like to suggest from the beginning, everything in the parts of the Bible that I call the religion of creation, from the earlier parts of Genesis to Exodus to Leviticus's provisions about Jubilee, and certainly to the New Testament messages of Jesus in the Gospels, show that this is the exact opposite of everything that Yahweh has told people to do, and that Joseph is acting precisely like Pharaoh, the very one who will enslave the Israelites and keep them in captivity for hundreds of years, starting in the very next book, in the book of Exodus. So before we enter into our immediate passage, you can see on the right side, as I've been going over in this unit from Genesis 46 to 50, basically the outline of the section, and you can see that our section here today is in part of an insert right in the middle of these two places. Here, Egypt versus Canaan is the place of settlement. And although many scholars, traditional source scholars, saw this as an insert that was somehow foreign to the narrative, I'd like to suggest and try to show in this video how it fits perfectly in there. And although it's certainly an insertion in the story between verses 12 and 27, where Israel settles in the land right after Joseph is said to provide for them, it's like a boulder thrown into a placid lake that splashes all over the sides and leads us to interpret the surrounding text in light of what we're told in this story. So as we look at it, let's keep that in mind, that although it's an insert, it fits perfectly well, and we can see how the language fits perfectly well too. So here's our passage here, and notice the highlighted things are the land of Egypt, the land of Canaan, livestock, etc. And in the previous scenes we saw the same words. We saw the land all over in the question of slaves, and we saw livestock, and so it fits exactly around the language, and the themes are obviously the same as well. So there's no need to see it completely as foreign. So let's just leave the words of it up here as we begin, and I've left verse 12 up from the previous scene, so we can note what some scholars can see as an inconsistency between verse 12 and 13, but maybe it's not an inconsistency in terms of source, maybe it's an inconsistency in terms of treatment. So we saw last time Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with food, literally with bread, lechem there, according to the number of their tenants, or literally, as I noted back here, according to the number of their children's mouths. And now we hear there was no food. So from a source perspective, that's seen as inconsistent. Wait a minute, we were just told there was food, and now we're told there's no food. So the author of this must have sloppily put in something inconsistent with verse 12. But we don't have to assume sloppy editors at all. We can assume a couple of things based on the text itself. One is that Joseph is treating his family differently, and we'll see it at the end. So he is providing for his family, but it'll be different for the Egyptians. But also, we know plainly, it's not a matter of there being no food, it's a matter of there being no free food. We saw when Joseph was interpreting Pharaoh's dream, and Pharaoh put him in charge of the land, and in 7 years of plenty, he was gathering up so much grain in the granaries that we were told that he stopped counting it. It was like the sand of the sea. We were told a little earlier that 2 years, and verse 6 of chapter 45, as you can see in my note below, that 2 years of the famine had gone by. So if this is either the third year or the fourth year, depending upon how we count, most of the food that was saved, the grain that was saved, is still there. And although, as we'll see in our story, the famine seems to be over at the end of our scene, and we haven't seen exactly 7 years go by, certainly at the beginning of the scene, there's plenty of food in the granaries. It's under Joseph, the foreigner's control. And isn't that just an amazing thing? What we see in this chapter is the exact opposite of what we'll see in the book of Exodus. There, Pharaoh makes slaves out of these foreign people, the Israelites or Hebrews that are in Egypt. Here, Joseph, the Hebrew or Israelite in the foreign land of Egypt, makes the local people, the Egyptians, all slaves in their own land. And one might even say that the enslavement of the Israelites in the next book is karma for what Joseph does to the Egyptians here, neither of them being God's will, as we'll see quite plainly, despite Joseph's arguments to the contrary, and despite some scholars' agreements with Joseph. So again, the word here is for bread. We see it 6 times in these 6 verses here, and it's only in chapter 49 after that. Plainly, there is no bread in the land, since bread is a product made from grain, but it's used as a synonym for grain and for food. For the famine was very severe, or literally heavy. There's no famine in the Torah after this. The next ones are in Ruth, or in the story that's in many ways parallel as a story near the end of the book in 2 Samuel 21, where David has to deal with the famine there. And there are connections, as we'll see, between the books of Samuel and our story, but we'll look at that in a minute. The land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. So now we can look at the scene, anticipate pilgrims of Canaanites, much like Jacob's sons were sent, coming to the land as the brothers did for a couple of years earlier, and that procession is continuing. But now all the Egyptians also were hungry. We'd not heard the Egyptians were hungry in the first place. We'd only seen that it was foreigners. And so, as we see in our first section, the narrator talks and Joseph does it without any introduction. So when we look at our 3 paragraphs here, in the first one, Joseph just does it and the Egyptians stay where they are. Joseph goes to them, at least with collectors of silver, and then sends the grain. But in the second one, we'll see the Egyptians not only come to him, they make a demand, but Joseph will indicate the price. Then in the final one, they'll make the demand and the price, their bodies and their land, and that will be the end of it, except for the exception of the priest that we'll see down here. So the first part is simply the narrator speaking and Joseph taking the initiative. So with the land languishing because of the famine, Joseph gathered or collected or scraped up, as Wenham suggests, as gleanings, all the silver to be found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, in exchange for the grain that they bought, although there's some questions here about language. So here it's not a lechem for bread, here it's shever, which is only in this verse in the story. We saw in 42, it literally means something like break, as in breakfast, but used for grain, for the food that breaks the fast in that sense, that they bought. And here it's shever twice, and so that's the point, that there's no verb for bought here. But it's clear that Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. He didn't keep it for himself. He's still a servant of Pharaoh. And there's a curious redundancy, at least in the original Egyptian sense of that, because the word Pharaoh in Egyptian means great house. So in the great house, sort of like ATM machine or PIN number, the way we might do it. But certainly the point is that the money goes to Pharaoh. If we think of it as going to his house, it could say to the Egyptian treasury as opposed to Pharaoh personally. But why does it matter? Neither Joseph or Pharaoh seem to need any money. They have everything they need. And the story moves on without any response, without the Egyptians reacting, saying thank you, or hearing anything from them, trying to just move us through these scenes so that we can see how relentless Joseph is. There's no small talk, there's no exchange of conversation, there's no bargaining. There's just supply and demand, and he has the supply and they have the demand. So my note below has simply what I've been pointing out about these 3 rounds here. So when the silver from the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan was spent, and the verb for spent, TMM, hard to pronounce without vowels here, it's only in 15 and 18 in Genesis, but 64 times in the Hebrew Scriptures, all the Egyptians came to Joseph. And let's just pause to envision this scene, which is obviously impossible. The entire land of Egypt empties out, sort of like the land of Canaan emptying out, and they're all coming to Joseph. Where is this scene taking place? We have no idea. We're never told where Pharaoh was, and we don't know where Joseph is. We know that his family is in the land of Goshen, but presumably Pharaoh is somewhere else. As I've been noting throughout this section, if we take this as a late text, perhaps from the time after Alexander the Great, when the Egyptian Ptolemies, the descendants of Alexander's people, the Greeks who are now in charge of Egypt in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, if it's in that time, Alexandria is the capital, and perhaps they're there, although that's the opposite side of the Nile Delta from Goshen, would take a long time to get over there. So we simply don't know where it is. The point isn't the geographic places. They came to Joseph, and that's the point. And they come with a demand in the imperative, give us food. Notice they're not saying sell us food, they have no money anymore, but they think he owes them food. And why shouldn't he? Isn't that the point? Why should it be something that he controls and sells to the very people that he's supposedly serving or working for? But that question isn't raised in the text. It can only be raised by the discussion we're having as readers or listeners throughout the ages. Then they ask this poignant question, why should we die before your eyes? The New RSV, in this case, revealing eyes that it often covers over. And it's a poignant scene, isn't it? That they're asking the question, do you really want to just watch us die? Are you so heartless and cold that you can just see us die right before you, not at a distance, but here? We don't hear Joseph's response. For our money is gone, our silver is gone, using aphes only here in the next verse when Joseph echoes it back a couple times elsewhere in Isaiah and the Psalm. And of course he knows that. And so he continues, Joseph answered, give me your animals, your livestock. And the word for give me here, I have here, is relatively rare in Genesis, almost always for an imperative, as we see a number of times, but specifically in the Tower of Babel story 3 times in Genesis 11, where it reflects a demand for humans to do something that is within God's authority. Here, Joseph demands they give it to him personally, although at the story's end, it's in his role as Pharaoh's agent, as we'll see in verse 20. So give me your animals, indicating in a certain sense that they're the very kind of former shepherds, the keepers of livestock, or the men of livestock, that Joseph warned them that Pharaoh doesn't like. They're an abomination. They were perhaps not taking care of it themselves. They just have their own as wealth, but not anymore. And I will give you food in exchange for bread if your money is gone. And do we take the if seriously? Suggesting that he thinks maybe they're lying to him, that they're withholding some of their money. We don't know, and nothing is followed up on that, but there certainly seems to be some suggestion that, well, if your money is gone, I'll take your livestock. What difference does it make? They're all value, whether it's silver or livestock, is all symbolic of value for something else, and they're running out of it quickly. So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food or bread in exchange for horses, flocks, herds, and donkeys. The word for horses is susim. It's a military animal, only here in chapter 49 in Genesis. But it's not just the animals they'd use for farming or for eating like flocks and herds, but for labor like donkeys and horses, a potential military. So in a sense, that Joseph is acquiring the military maneuvering ability of the very people, perhaps nationalizing it, so to speak, what had been private horses, a private militia in a sense, and turning it into a national repository for horses. And when we think of it at the national level, that brings up the parallel with the question of the Israelites having a king back in 1 Samuel 8. And there are a number of parallels here that are worth paying attention to. Certainly 1 Samuel would have been a text known to the readers and listeners of this late text of Genesis. And in 1 Samuel 8, if you haven't followed my Samuel series or not familiar, the people demand a king because of their fear of the Philistines and their iron chariots. And Samuel's upset about it, but he goes to Yahweh, and Yahweh says, it's not you they've rejected, it's me they've rejected from being king over them. But tell them what it's going to be like to be a king, to be under a king. And 6 times we hear the verb take. And I've highlighted them here in the red italicized section so we can see how well it fits with the scene here. So starting right where we were, they brought their livestock to Joseph. In exchange, they gave up horses, flocks, herds, and donkeys. And we were told the king will take the best of your cattle and donkeys and 1/10 of your flocks. And then the scene we're about to go into, Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, and the Egyptians sold their fields. And we heard in 1 Samuel, he will take the best of your fields and give them to his courtiers, as Joseph gives them to the land of Pharaoh's. And then finally, Joseph makes slaves of them from one end of Egypt to the other, and Samuel's warning via Yahweh's, you shall all be slaves. And then at the end, at the harvest, you should give 1/5 to Pharaoh, and in 1 Samuel, he will take 1/10 of your grain in your vineyards. Not exactly the same measure, but the same point, of course. Which is to say that Joseph is acting exactly like Yahweh warned them that a king would act. And if this story is from the time after exile, the Israelites or the Judahites aren't under their own king. They would have under precisely foreign kings. And what we're seeing here is it doesn't make any difference if the king is Pharaoh or Joseph. They act exactly the same way. And so for commentators who think, well, Joseph is doing a good thing, he's Joseph, he's an Israelite, it must be good, note that he acts exactly as we'll see Pharaoh act, enslaving the people. He doesn't put harsh labor on them as far as we know, but he's going to turn them into tenant farmers, as we see. So that year he supplied them with food in exchange for all their grain. Literally the word means led, and we see it, Brown Driver Griggs Lexicon has it as a guide to a watering place or a station and cause to rest there. So suggesting he's leading them into a time of rest, at least till the end of that year. Let's scroll down so we can see a little more of our story. But when that year was ended, they came to him the following year. This is the only place we see the explicit sequence. And as I was noting in a few verses, we'll see that he gives them seed, which suggests the famine is over. So we don't follow 7 years, but it's either the 3rd or the 4th if we're following it in the chronology we've been giving. And they said to him, we cannot hide from our Lord that our money is spent. Well, not at this point. It's been a couple of years. We saw the word for hiding a couple of times in Exodus, and then we see it interestingly in 1 Samuel. I won't take the time to go over those, but you can look at those if you want to see the parallels. And the herds of cattle are my Lord's. There is nothing left in the sight of my Lord or in your eyes, but our bodies and our lands. Or literally, as Wenham notes, the word genei, it means corpses. So it's as if they're already dead before they say in verse 9, shall we die before your eyes? their dying bodies, although they haven't been bereft of food, they've been given enough food, but now it's run out. And so now they continue. This time they make the proposal contrary to verse 16. Shall we die before your eyes? Again, before your eyes, both we and our land. And notice from their perspective, a very religion of creation perspective, biblically speaking, that the land is a living entity that can die as well. And we've seen throughout Genesis that the land was responsive to God's word in the very beginning, bringing forth water and fruit and animals and things. And it also has a mouth that swallows up Abel's blood when Cain kills him. So the land is a living thing in the biblical sense. It doesn't take the modern quasi-scientific notion of Gaia, that the earth is a living organism in the sense we would understand it, to recognize that the ancients saw that God was the creator and the earth was part of God's creation and was a living being. So the Egyptians are seeing it that way, even though they haven't read Genesis 1 and don't have a biblical sense of things. This is put in their mouth that they're concerned about their land dying, which brings up the Jubilee questions from Leviticus 26 that we'll see more explicitly in just a minute, where a very different way of engaging this is at stake. So buy us, or literally acquire us, as in Eve acquiring a man, as she said, with the help of Yahweh back in chapter 4, and a couple other acquirings. Let's look especially at 39:1 at the beginning of our section here. Joseph was taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him, or literally acquired him, from the Ishmaelites. So at the beginning of our story, Pharaoh's right-hand man buys this foreigner, acquires him, and now that person has become the right-hand man, certainly seemingly in the place of Potiphar, as enslaving the very people who bought him or acquired him in the first place. So the acquiring has gone all the way back around. And then they say positively, as if it's a good thing, we with our land will become slaves to Pharaoh. Just give us seed that we may live and not die, and the land not become desolate. So the give us seed is suggesting the famine is over, and now they're ready to plant their own food. But the word for desolate is exactly what links us to the Jubilee provisions in chapter 26 that you can see in my note below. To Shem here, and it's 7 times in that passage in Leviticus 26:22-43, the magic number of 7 for completion. And 7 is key to that passage because the Jubilee is all about 7 times 7 in the 50th year after that. So as exile there. And in that story, the Leviticus story, when people refuse to share, when they refuse to let go of debts and refuse to treat the land well and give it a rest and give each other a rest, the land will get its rest with them off it in exile. Here, they'll be enslaved to the land as tenant farmers, and plainly not God's will according to Leviticus. So this is one of a number of places where we see, if we listen to the religion of creation story that continues from Genesis through Exodus and Leviticus, we see just how wrong-headed Joseph's whole plan is here, and the audience certainly should understand that. So it concludes this section. Joseph bought all the land, or acquired again here, all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. All the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was severe and the land became Pharaoh's, summarizing it. As for the people, he made slaves of them from one end of Egypt to the other, according to the ORSV. But this verse has a lot of challenges in the translation, so many scholars note that below. So I provided the whole Masoretic and Septuagint versions of it here. We'll just look at the translation. So the Masoretic has, as for the people, he made them pass over to the cities from one end of Egypt to the other. And Wenham notes he finds the Masoretic, quote, difficult to understand, unquote, because the people would continue to be needed on the land rather than the cities. But I would suggest that the city message there is very clear, that as we see in the global economy or throughout all of history, when empires take over indigenous people's land and turn them either into tenant farmers or displace them from the land, they often migrate into the city as beggars or as day laborers or as something else, creating megacities. And Rome certainly in its day was a megacity, limited only by its wall and its boundary for a size. Nowadays, cities, whether in Africa or in Latin America, can grow to tens of millions of largely people who have been displaced from the land and the rich who profit off the benefits of cities. So that version of it could well make sense, that if they're displaced from the land, they need to go into the cities. The Septuagint has very differently, and the people he enslaved into slaves from one boundary of Egypt to the other, not focusing on the city element. So the tradition has left us both versions of the outcome there. And then we get to this exception, and I'll scroll down to the rest of our scene on both sides so we can see the chiastic shape here. And the priests get an exception a little differently than Levites and priests do in the Bible. There, according in the book of Joshua and Deuteronomy as well, the Levites and priests don't get land because they have other duties, and people who have land provide for them from that land so they can serve what eventually will be the Jerusalem temple. But here, there isn't something like the temple, and the priests obviously have land, but they're given an exception because Joseph and Pharaoh need the priest to tell a story that justifies why this is happening. And certainly Alexander the Great understood that the Egyptian priests proclaimed him as a descendant of Pharaoh, which is how they succumbed to the leadership of a foreigner, a Macedonian in the case of Alexander, but here in the case of a Hebrew, not reigning instead of Pharaoh, but reigning with Pharaoh's authority. But that authority comes from the background of the priest telling a story that says Pharaoh has that authority. So they need the priest. They always need a religion of empire story to justify what they're doing. So we hear the land of the priest he did not buy. The priest had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh. The word hawk for fixed allowance is only here in verse 26, the chiastic parallel in Genesis, 130 times in the Hebrew scripture. But it's next, and importantly, in Exodus 5:14, for Pharaoh allotting a requirement of bricks to them. So an allowance in a negative sense. These are how many bricks you must bring me. And so the priests live on the allowance that Pharaoh had gave them, almost like pets there, and therefore did not sell their land, make them as dependent upon Pharaoh as the tenant farmers are. And so Joseph concludes with a statute. He said to the people, all of Egypt gathered before him, now that I've this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh, suggesting the day will be memorialized as a special day, here is seed for you. Sow the land. As we'll see in the next scene, and you can see it already on the right side, the Israelites, soon to be called the Israelites, were fruitful and multiplied, not only echoing what we see in Genesis 1 as God's will, but anticipating what I was saying earlier when they arrived in the land, when Jacob and his family came with his sons and his daughters, and his seed, which is to say his other sons, but I was suggesting he was like a farmer planting his family in Egypt, and we're about to see exactly how the harvest of Israelites is fruitful and multiplied exceedingly. Whether the harvest of grain for the Egyptians is, we will have to find out a little later or not find out. But here's what he says now. At the harvest you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh. In other words, since they don't own the land and they have no money, all they can do to pay for the right to farm the land is a 20% tax to Pharaoh. Forever. For, as we'll see, 4/5 shall be your own as seed for your field, as food for yourselves and your households, as food to your little ones, echoing the bringing of little ones of Jacob's sons to Egypt, as we saw earlier, and also those in chapter 50 in the final blessing. And they say in the end, it's really amazing. You have saved our lives. It doesn't say thank you so much, but you have saved our lives. In the Hebrew, nimsa chen, 56 times in Genesis with a wide range of meanings. But in the Septuagint, using the portentous word sozo, which is used so many times in the New Testament for saved or for healing. Your faith has saved you or healed you, using sozo. Here, it's not God or Jesus that saves, it's Joseph by taking everything they have and letting them live. And they say, may it please my Lord, although this is difficult to translate exactly. Here it's with the eyes. It's literally our eyes are before the Lord and through my Lord. So it's a sense of we become slaves through Joseph's actions. So through my Lord, we will be slaves to Pharaoh. So finally, Joseph made it a statute, and little did we know that Joseph was a lawgiver, that he had the authority in Egypt to make a law that stands to this day, whenever that day is. As my note below has, the Egyptian provision initiated ironically by an Israelite becomes the basis for a primary distinction between Torah and empire, the absence of the sabbatical/jubilee provisions for preventing this misfortune from leading to permanent slavery. And the land of the priests alone did not become Pharaoh's. And it'd be tempting to continue here because it does flow so nicely, but we'll stop there. This video has gone long enough, and we'll see next time what happens at the end of Jacob's life. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.